So it's my pleasure to introduce Dan Williams from Cambridge. Dan did his PhD in 2018, also at Cambridge with Richard Holton and Hugh Price, is that right?
Yeah.
And then went on to do a postdoc in Antwerp with Ben Snane before returning to Cambridge to be a research fellow at Corpus Christi. He's also an associate fellow of the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence. And he works on loads of cool stuff. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dan, who's going to be talking to us about signaling, solidarity, and strategic delusions. Take it away, Dan.
Okay, has that screen shared for everyone?
Looks good to me.
Okay, so just to start, thank you to Sam for the really generous invitation to come and talk here today, and thank you to all of you for giving up your time to come and listen to it. So signaling, solidarity, and strategic delusions. I'm going to start with a quote that I love from the cultural anthropologist and cognitive scientist Dan Sperber, who writes, "Apparently irrational cultural beliefs are quite remarkable. They do not appear irrational by slightly departing from common sense or timidly going beyond what the evidence allows. They appear rather like downright provocations against common sense rationality." So here are some examples of beliefs that appear to be widely held today, or at the very least held by a non-trivial number of people. Donald Trump was involved in a covert battle against a cabal of Satan-worshipping cannibalistic pedophiles that won the Democratic Party. That's QAnon, many of you will be familiar with that. 19th century American prophet Joseph Smith received a revelation from the creator of the universe that Jesus Christ's second coming will occur in Missouri. The Earth is a flat disk surrounded by a 150-foot wall of ice guarded by NASA employees. Every human being is an immortal, non-physical entity called a thetan, with many past lives among extraterrestrial civilizations, which can be recalled through a process of auditing with accredited Scientologists. Okay, so for most people who don't share these beliefs, I think it's fair to say that they seem absurd. By which I mean they don't seem sort of mildly or even moderately irrational, because for the most part, it's sort of easy to understand how people arrive at irrational beliefs. We deceive ourselves, we engage in wishful thinking, we rely upon sort of fast and frugal heuristics that are often unreliable, and so on. But these beliefs, and beliefs like them, seem extremely irrational. So much so that it can be difficult to understand how anyone could seriously entertain these ideas, let alone endorse them. And in that respect, there is at least a kind of surface, much remarked upon similarity between beliefs of the kind that I've just outlined, and at least certain examples of clinical delusions of the sort that you find in conditions such as schizophrenia. Crucially though, most of the people who embrace the beliefs I've just outlined are seemingly sort of happy, healthy, well-functioning individuals with no psychiatric or neurological disorder. So that gives rise to a classic question in psychiatry and the philosophy of psychiatry, which is what, if not the sort of peculiarity of their content or their putatively fairly extreme irrationality, really distinguishes sort of widely held, fairly bizarre beliefs that prevail in the general population from clinical delusions? Now, one influential answer to this question appeals to social factors. So for example, the DSM-4 defines a clinical delusion not just as a false belief based on incorrect inference about external reality that is firmly sustained despite what constitutes incontrovertible and obvious evidence to the contrary, because as many people have pointed out, that captures many non-delusional beliefs, or at least many non-clinically delusional beliefs. But also, they add, this belief should not ordinarily be accepted by other members of the person's culture or subculture. So in other words, what distinguishes sort of widely held, seemingly bizarre beliefs in the general population from clinical delusions is precisely that the former class of beliefs are widely held. They're associated with a kind of community of like-minded believers, whereas clinical delusions tend to be, maybe not always, but they tend to be highly individual and idiosyncratic. The problem with this view is that although it does seem to identify sort of what is an important difference between these kinds of beliefs in many cases, doesn't offer any explanation of why that difference should be relevant, sort of why the mere prevalence of a belief should affect its clinical, pathological, delusional status. And in general, there's something kind of arbitrary about it, as if an individual would cease to be delusional if only she could persuade enough people to share in the content of her delusion. That seems kind of weird. There's a second view which just sort of dispenses with considerations of social context and irrationality altogether, and points out that clinical delusions by their very nature are the product of some kind of dysfunction or set of dysfunctions in the relevant individual's psychology. That's what makes them a symptom of a mental or psychiatric disorder. Whereas the kinds of beliefs that I outlined at the beginning, as I mentioned there, are the product of what is presumably a sort of well-functioning or properly functioning or properly psychology, or functional psychology, sorry. There's nothing sort of pathological about the individual's minds who harbor these beliefs. Now, again, I think that gets us something important, but it does give rise to another classic puzzle, this time in psychology and the philosophy of mind, which is how on earth could, and sort of why do, seemingly well-functioning psychological mechanisms give rise to beliefs that seem genuinely absurd? And that's puzzling, or at least it has puzzled many psychologists and philosophers of mind, because it's plausible to think that, at least in some sense, the function of beliefs is to track how things are, and so be responsive to evidence and reasons which bear on how things are. Now, as I've already mentioned, there are all sorts of distorting factors in human cognition that can sort of bias us away from truth. There's wishful thinking, there's self-deception, there's a kind of chronic trade-off between efficiency and reliability when it comes to judgment and decision-making. But even taking into consideration those distorting factors, it can be difficult to understand how sort of otherwise well-functioning psychological mechanisms would give rise to beliefs that seem so radically divorced from reality and at odds with widely available evidence. Okay, what I'm going to try to do in this talk is sort of clarify and explore, and at least offer a kind of partial or tentative defense of a particular solution to this puzzle, according to which, at least in some cases, the absurdity of widespread beliefs in society is best viewed as a strategic response to the signaling incentives generated by coalitions. More concretely, what I'm going to argue is that precisely because the absurd beliefs embraced by certain groups and communities damage the reputation of those in-group members in the eyes of out-group members, these beliefs can function as credible signals of solidarity with in-group members, or credible signals of in-group solidarity, such that certain groups and communities end up making the adoption and advertisement of absurd and so stigmatizing beliefs, what I'm going to call strategic delusions, part of their membership fee. That is, within these communities, the absurdity of these beliefs is a feature, not a bug. And it's this signaling strategy, I think, that explains, at least in some cases, why sort of well-functioning psychological mechanisms give rise to genuinely absurd beliefs under certain conditions, but also why the social context of such beliefs is actually relevant to their non-pathological or non-clinically delusional status. Now, variants of this idea have appeared a few times before in the psychological and philosophical literature, including in my own work, but typically in a really kind of schematic and underdeveloped form. So what I'm going to try to do in this talk is move beyond this previous work in two principled ways. Firstly, I'm going to try to develop a more sort of fleshed out framework for understanding the cooperative group dynamics and motivational processes that connect absurd beliefs with social signaling. And then I'm going to motivate 7 distinctive, and I hope in some cases sort of surprising and interesting predictions of this framework that can be used to distinguish it from more influential explanations of bizarre beliefs in psychology. So the talk is going to be a kind of blend of philosophy of mind, but also speculative psychology and speculative social science. I'm going to break the talk down into 3 relatively self-contained parts. In part 1, I'm going to try to explain how and why certain kinds of costly behavioral signals of in-group solidarity emerge. In part 2, I'm going to argue that you can, at least in principle, extend this framework to the emergence of sort of psychological phenomena, such as beliefs. And then in part 3, I'm going to identify these predictions I've just mentioned and say a little bit about how I think sort of current evidence, both observational and experimental data, but also just common sense observation, bear on these predictions. Okay, part 1, coalitions, cooperation, communication. So I think there is a sort of deep and difficult to deny sense in which human beings are a tribal or groupish, or the term that I prefer, a coalitional species. So from small scale shifting alliances and factions to larger scale, more stable bands, tribes, sects, cults, political parties, online communities, religious groups, and so on. Much of human social life, both today but also historically, has been characterized by sort of complex, often impressive forms of within-group cooperation, and sometimes like fairly intense forms of intergroup competition. Now, obviously, that's a fairly heterogeneous list of coalitions, and in general, coalitions vary along numerous dimensions, so size, structure, purpose, membership criteria, longevity, and so on. But all coalitions share in common, and in fact, the thing that makes them coalitions is the use of some kind of within-group cooperation and coordination to achieve goals that couldn't be achieved, or at least couldn't be achieved as easily by individual means. So that's why people join coalitions, that's why they're such a sort of pervasive and important feature of the human social landscape. Now, sometimes the goals that coalitions seek to advance are kind of narrow and explicit. So think of an animal rights group, for example. What it does is kind of stated on the tin. But precisely because the within-group cooperation that coalitions provide is so potentially sort of beneficial for group members, many coalitions operate as sort of general purpose amplification coalitions, to borrow a term from Tooby and Cosmides. They provide sort of open-ended mutual aid, social support, and opportunities for collective action among group members. And crucially, many coalitions are sort of ostensibly organized around narrow goals. So think of a church community that congregates for collective worship, for example, often operate as sort of general purpose amplification coalitions in practice, providing a much larger range of often much less tangible social and communal benefits for group members. Now, notoriously, this dependence of coalitions on cooperation makes them inherently fragile. And specifically, it makes them vulnerable to the problem of free riders. That is, individuals who seek to reap the benefits of within-group cooperation without kind of paying their dues, without paying any of the costs required to sustain those benefits for others. And if that strategy becomes sort of practically advantageous, it will just proliferate throughout a population, and that group will go extinct. So in order to survive, let alone in order to sort of thrive and succeed in the context of often high stakes competition with other coalitions, coalitions need to develop some means of sort of guarding against this problem, of facilitating, incentivizing within group cooperation. Now, one strategy that's often discussed in the social sciences is what's sometimes called a control strategy, where the idea is a cooperative group sort of enforces within group cooperation by some kind of surveillance and sanctioning mechanism. In other words, if you're not paying your dues, if you're sort of failing to live up to group-specific norms and obligations, you're going to be punished, shunned, ostracized, excluded, and so on. Now, clearly, this strategy is in play in many kinds of social contexts, but it's not a panacea because it gives rise to collective action problems of its own. Like the very enforcement of within-group cooperation is itself a kind of within-group cooperation that needs to be explained. There's another strategy, sometimes called a choice strategy, where the idea is rather than trying to sort of coerce individuals who are already members of a group to engage in within-group cooperation, you just choose individuals as group members from the outset in accordance with what I'm going to call their in-group solidarity. That is, their kind of emotional attachment to the group and their willingness to invest in it. So to quote Kim Stironi, and here I've been really influenced by his work on the evolution of human cooperation, in many circumstances, successful cooperation depends on identifying reliable partners while yourself being reliable. In such cases, the problem is not to force cooperation from those with whom you are fated to interact. Rather, it is to choose well in the first place and to be chosen by others. The problem with this strategy is that in-group solidarity is not an observable trait. It's not like your hair color or how big you are. It's a function of your psychological profile, your sort of emotional attachment to the group and your beliefs, desires, intentions. So in order to execute this strategy, groups need to develop ways of sort of reliably distinguishing between those individuals who are sort of genuinely attached to the group and willing to invest in it, sort of individuals high in group solidarity, and those individuals lacking in this characteristic. And that's what takes us from sort of abstract considerations about the nature of cooperation to signaling and signaling theory. It's a kind of familiar idea in the social sciences that many kinds of sort of seemingly arbitrary group-specific costs, sacrifices, restrictions, rituals, and so on should be understood in terms of the role that they play in solving the communication problem that I just outlined. That is, the role that they play in signaling in-group solidarity. Now, the specific strategy of this kind that I'm going to focus on in this talk is acts and traits that signal solidarity with one group by sort of amplifying defection costs, by increasing the costs of, or in some cases eliminating the possibility of, defection to other groups. So precisely by making it more difficult to join out groups, these acts and traits constitute credible signals of solidarity to the in-group. So to quote Stironi again, by making migration between groups more difficult, such signals make individuals within groups more trustworthy. And examples of this phenomenon appear to be sort of fairly widespread in the human social world. I'll just run through a few examples to give some sort of illustration of how this works. So firstly, group-specific body modifications, and that's going to include everything from sort of gang tattoos in prisons to the more radical forms of scarification practiced by many tribes, will often sort of permanently identify individuals as a member of the group in a way that makes it extremely difficult, if not outright suicidal, to try to join alternative groups. And precisely because of that fact, these indelible markings constitute credible signals of allegiance to the relevant groups. It's also been argued in the social sciences that certain kinds of group-specific traits, clothes, rituals, restrictions, and so on that invite stigma and sometimes ridicule from outsiders, or at least in some cases selected, at least in part, because of that effect. Sort of precisely by stigmatizing in-group members in the eyes of out-group members, these traits constitute sort of credible signals of allegiance to in-group members. You can think of that as the kind of goth effect. And importantly, this kind of estrangement from outsiders can take much more extreme forms. So Stironi writes of the initiation rituals of gangs, subcultures on the fringe of society, and cults, as often involving high-priced defection from the norms of larger society. And it illustrates that by appeal to a notorious New Zealand motorcycle gang in which individuals have to enact an extreme form of violence against random individuals in society as a condition of entry. So precisely by alienating themselves from broader civil society, these acts constitute sort of credible signals of allegiance to the relevant criminal gang. Now, those are kinds of diverse cases, but the game-theoretic rationale underlying them is basically the same. In order to sort of credibly signal your in-group solidarity, you have to be able to credibly commit to continued cooperation within the group, even if the opportunity for profitable defection arises. Now, acts that amplify defection costs constitute what the game theorist Thomas Schelling famously called an external solution to this commitment problem, whereby individuals intervene in their environment, in this case their social environment, to make sticking with the group the conspicuously rational course of action. So in that sense, there's a kind of analogy here with an invading army that burns the bridges behind it, except in this case, the bridges constitute metaphorical bridges to the broader social world. But the kind of underlying rationale here is basically the same. Now, clearly, and I hope obviously, there's no suggestion here that individuals are sort of consciously aware of the signaling function of these behaviors, much less the game-theoretic rationale that underlies them. They might be, but there's sort of no assumption that they have to be. So in that sense, this framework often purports to be a kind of surprising theoretical discovery that might be as opaque to the individuals engaging in these behaviors as the communicative rationale of peacock tails is to peacocks. To make sense of that, I think you have to assume that in many cases, individuals acting out sort of unconscious drives or motivations to advertise their in-group solidarity and have some sort of tacit or implicit recognition of which acts and traits are likely to be conducive to that goal in their environment. I find that assumption legitimate because I think people are often in the dark about what motivates their behavior, but it is worth sort of flagging and putting up front that that is an assumption of this framework in many cases. Okay, so you're probably wondering what any of this has to do with sort of bizarre societal beliefs. And I realize lots of that was just extremely abstract, so you might reasonably have fallen asleep in the past 10 or 15 minutes. If you did, the sort of chief points moving forward are just these. Firstly, human beings are a coalitional species. We form sort of strong in-group attachments and draw strong in-group out-group distinctions. Because of their cooperative nature, many coalitions often develop ways of reliably communicating and detecting the degree of in-group solidarity, sort of in-group allegiance among members and prospective members. Acting in ways that sort of deliberately amplifies defection costs constitutes a potential and a potentially widespread solution to this problem. Okay, what I now want to do is take this sort of abstract framework for understanding certain kinds of puzzling in-group behaviors and extend it to illuminate certain kinds of puzzling in-group beliefs. And specifically, I want to explore what I'm going to call the strategic delusion hypothesis, according to which the absurdity of at least certain examples of group beliefs is best viewed as a strategic amplification of defection costs, whereby alienating believers from those outside of the group, sincere endorsement and advertisement of such beliefs constitutes a reliable barometer of in-group solidarity. So before I turn to the question of why you should actually find this plausible, if you should find it plausible, I'm going to first address the question of like how this is even coherent, like how you might take a framework which applies to sort of outward observable traits and behaviors and extend it to psychological phenomena such as beliefs. And to that end, I think it's useful to sort of first step back and address some more general questions about belief and belief formation in human psychology. So in general, when we believe something, some proposition P, we take P to be the case. And that's going to include everything from sort of mundane propositions like Paris is the capital of France, there's milk in the fridge, the meeting is at 11 o'clock tomorrow, but also more sort of recondite propositions like God is three persons in one. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's a sort of influential view that you find in the philosophy of mind, but also certain parts of psychology, according to which the function of beliefs is really to kind of track how things are. Beliefs have a kind of representational function. In the words of Frank Ramsey, they constitute the sort of background maps by which we steer. They provide us with, or they aim to provide us with, sort of accurate propositional information that we can use in guiding our inferences and decisions. And just like you're going to be more successful when it comes to reaching your destination, if you've got an accurate map, on this view, you're going to be more successful when it comes to sort of achieving your goals, satisfying your desires, sort of navigating reality more generally, if you've got accurate beliefs. So you have a kind of practical stake when it comes to getting things right on this view. Now, if you have this conception of beliefs, you're going to expect beliefs to have characteristics sort of adapted to this function or specialized for this function. Most obviously, you would expect beliefs to be highly evidence responsive. So if the function of these beliefs is to track how things are, they should be sort of responsive to evidence and reasons concerning how things are. So if you believe there's milk in the fridge, you open the fridge and there's no milk there, you should sort of relinquish that belief. You would also expect these beliefs to be inferentially promiscuous, which is a kind of really annoying philosophical name for the idea that when you believe something, you're sort of eager to draw upon that belief in inference and decision-making whenever its content might be relevant. Now, according to many philosophers of mind, not only should we expect beliefs to have these characteristics, but when you turn to how individuals actually go about forming and maintaining beliefs, you find beliefs with these characteristics. That is, although there are sort of various kinds of distorting factors, for the most part on this view, individuals form beliefs in a way that is highly responsive to evidence, and they sort of freely draw upon these beliefs in inference and decision-making whenever their content might be relevant to the task at hand. Now, in my view, this conception of beliefs doesn't do justice to the profound social character of belief formation in our species, and specifically the fact that our beliefs are objects of intense social scrutiny. We spend much of our time sort of communicating what we believe, attributing beliefs to other people, and crucially, we care what other people believe. We treat people differently as a consequence of which beliefs we attribute to them. Now, that might not matter in terms of its implications for how to understand belief formation, except for the fact that the kinds of beliefs that elicit desirable responses from other people are not identical with the kinds of beliefs that are best supported by the believer's available evidence. And that should lead us, I think, to expect that at least some kinds of beliefs are going to be adapted not to tracking how things are, but rather to our social environment or milieu. These beliefs are going to be sort of strategic responses to these social incentives, which come into conflict with the dispassionate acquisition of knowledge. So, for example, I think that we often gravitate towards self-serving and self-aggrandizing beliefs as tools for persuading other agents of our social value. I think we gravitate towards beliefs that justify actions we want to undertake in states of affairs that we want to preserve. And most relevant to this talk, I think we often gravitate towards beliefs that advertise their membership of and allegiance to the groups and communities to which we belong. Now, insofar as there's some class of beliefs with this socially adaptive function, you would expect these beliefs to behave very differently to sort of ordinary representational or world modeling beliefs. Most obviously, you wouldn't expect these beliefs to be particularly evidence responsive. So if their function is not to track how things are, you wouldn't expect individuals to be sort of responsive to evidence concerning how things are. But also, you wouldn't really expect them to be inferentially promiscuous in the sense described earlier. Instead, you would expect them to be kind of compartmentalized in the individual believer's mental life. So if you're forming these beliefs not to track how things are, but to sort of elicit desirable responses from other people, you should be kind of reluctant to draw inferences from these beliefs or to act on these beliefs if these inferences and actions aren't themselves socially rewarded. Because otherwise you're going to risk letting potentially inaccurate information sort of compromise your ability to navigate reality effectively. Now, I've argued in line with the work of many others that when you turn to the sort of prime candidates of socially adaptive belief, things like ideological convictions, religious beliefs, self-aggrandizing beliefs, you often find beliefs with this sort of functional profile. That is, beliefs that are kind of stubborn, they're not particularly responsive to evidence and reasons which bear on their truth, and that are often sort of strangely cordoned off from the rest of the individual believer's mental life. Now, one way of understanding this concept of socially adaptive belief is in terms of signaling. So in general, a signal, and this is going to include everything from sort of the tails of peacocks to the alarm calls produced by vervet monkeys to exam qualifications, can be understood as objects or behaviors designed or selected to communicate information to be detected by other agents in order to modify their behavior. And that's exactly how certain examples of socially adaptive beliefs should be understood. That is, as beliefs that we form in order to communicate information to be detected by other agents in order to elicit desirable responses from them. And I think a useful sort of analogy here is with clothing. So if you ask yourself, like, why do people wear clothes? Well, clothes have a kind of boring utilitarian function. They keep you warm, they protect you from the elements. You can carry things in clothes, it's quite useful. But because clothes are sort of objects of social scrutiny, people adjust their clothing choices to advertise sort of socially desirable characteristics they have. So their personality traits, the groups they belong to, their social status, and so on. Similarly, beliefs have a kind of boring representational function. They provide us with, or they aim to provide us with, accurate propositional information that we can use in guiding our inferences and decisions. But because beliefs are sort of objects of social scrutiny, people adjust their beliefs to communicate various socially desirable characteristics they have or purport to have. Now, this framework, I think, is exactly how strategic delusion should be understood if this hypothesis is correct. That is, as sort of objects, beliefs, and the behaviors these beliefs give rise to, selected to communicate information about the believer's in-group solidarity, to be detected by other group members in order to elicit desirable responses from them. That is, in order to increase their willingness to trust and cooperate with the relevant believer. Crucially though, strategic delusions on this hypothesis are like a very specific kind of signaling strategy. So the concept of socially adaptive belief here is much more general than the concept of strategic delusions. That is, cases in which, or alleged cases in which individuals sort of embrace group-specific absurdities as a way of signaling in-group solidarity. So I think there are potentially sort of multiple ways in which beliefs can perform signaling functions in the context of groups that are different from strategic delusions. And I'm just going to run through a few examples of these to give a sort of better illustration of how strategic delusions should be understood. So firstly, groups often sort of breed pro-in-group beliefs and anti-out-group beliefs among their members. So think sort of Liverpool are the best, Man United are rubbish, for a kind of anodyne example of this. You might think what's going on in that kind of case is a kind of signaling. So by believing that my group is the best, I sort of credibly signal to fellow group members that I'm likely to be committed and loyal to my group. Now, that might be true. I'm not going to argue that it is true or that it isn't true, but it's fundamentally different from what I'm talking about in this presentation. These kinds of pro-in-group beliefs wouldn't signal in-group solidarity by amplifying defection costs. They'd rather sort of signal in-group commitment because there's a reliable connection between their content, namely believing that your group is the best and being committed to the group. Secondly, I suggested at the outset that certain kinds of religious beliefs might be amenable to an explanation of the kind that the strategic delusions hypothesis provides. But importantly, I definitely don't think this is going to apply to all kinds of religious beliefs. I think some religious beliefs are sort of plausibly not irrational. I think some religious beliefs that are irrational are going to have different kinds of like underlying explanations, causes, biases, motivations, and also potentially different kinds of signaling strategies. So for example, it's been argued that belief in sort of powerful, moralizing, supernatural entities, sort of entities whose rewards and punishments track conformity to and deviation from group-specific norms, is a kind of signaling strategy. So by believing in these powerful, moralizing gods, we sort of credibly signal to other people that we're likely to be moral and trustworthy insofar as you harbor this belief. Again, I'm not arguing that that is correct, but if it is correct, it's fundamentally different from what I'm talking about in this presentation. So these kinds of beliefs wouldn't signal in-group solidarity by amplifying defection costs. Rather, they would signal a kind of in-group trustworthiness because there's a reliable connection between their content, namely belief in powerful, moralistic, supernatural entities, and being moral and trustworthy. And then finally, there's a sort of increasingly influential idea in psychology, according to which certain kinds of group-specific beliefs can be biased towards irrationality solely through the role they play in group identification. Where the idea here is, if you take a belief like Paris is the capital of France, that would be a really rubbish badge of group identity because everyone believes that, because Paris is the capital of France. Whereas if you take a belief like God is three persons in one, presumably you're only going to believe that if you're a member of a very specific kind of community or subculture. And so you might argue that what's going on in those cases is precisely a kind of in-group signaling. By embracing and advertising this belief, you sort of mark yourself out as a member of a particular group. For what it's worth, I'm fairly skeptical of this explanation. I think that if your only goal is to sort of identify individuals who are already members of a group, there are much easier ways of doing it. But whatever you think about this explanation is very different from strategic delusions, which aren't mere badges of group identity, they're signals of in-group solidarity that are effective not because they're group-specific, but because they alienate believers from those outside of the group. Okay, so in my view, strategic delusions should be understood as an example of this more general phenomenon of socially adaptive belief selected for their signaling function, and specifically a kind of socially adaptive belief that performs a very specific kind of signaling strategy in which individuals embrace group-specific absurdities in order to alienate themselves from outsiders, for example, by damaging their reputation in the eyes of outsiders, and thereby signal solidarity with insiders. Now, how should this actually be understood psychologically? Sort of what's going on within the mind of someone who forms and maintains a belief in this way, if this hypothesis is correct? So crucially, and I hope obviously, there's no suggestion that individuals are sort of consciously forming beliefs through an awareness of their social effects. I think that would just be very, very implausible as an explanation of what's going on here. I think it's also plausibly just a characteristic of belief formation that you can't just choose to form a belief for sort of non-epistemic reasons, for reasons independent of its truth. So in my view, socially adaptive belief generally should be understood in terms of independently well-established, more general tendencies to engage in motivated reasoning or motivated cognition, where sort of roughly speaking, motivated reasoning involves the influence of non-epistemic motivations, that is motivations sort of independent of the concern for knowledge or truth, that bias individuals towards desired beliefs by unconsciously adjusting strategies for seeking out, collecting, and processing information. Now, although I think there's sort of much that we don't understand about motivated reasoning, I do think the psychological literature gives rise to several clear lessons that can be used to illuminate what's going on when it comes to strategic delusions if this hypothesis is correct. So firstly, in virtue of being motivated reasoning is kind of goal-driven. And in my view, the kinds of goals that can underpin motivated reasoning are sort of as general as the kinds of goals that can underpin motivated behavior more generally. The only real condition is that they come into conflict with the sort of dispassionate acquisition of knowledge. So it's going to include goals like the desire to think well of oneself, to protect one's self-image, to boost one's self-esteem, to advance one's social status. And if the strategic delusions hypothesis is correct, to advertise one's in-group solidarity. where the idea would be individuals have this goal and some sort of implicit recognition and unfounded belief is going to be conducive to that goal, and that leads them to engage in a kind of motivated mistreatment of information which bears on that belief. Secondly, in virtue of being motivated, motivated reasoning is affect, or sort of more generally emotion-laden. So beliefs often have sort of powerful consequences for how we feel, both because of the states of affairs that those beliefs represent, which we might find desirable or undesirable, but also because of how these beliefs sort of fit into, contribute to, hinder our broader goals. So for example, if you want to think well of yourself and you come into contact with evidence that you've acted badly, that might lead you to a sort of really distressing emotional experience if you come to believe that you're a bad person. So one way of sort of avoiding that distressing emotional experience is just to kind of neglect or mistreat evidence concerning that bad act in order to sort of preserve that comforting conviction in your moral value and self-esteem. And that provides a sort of cartoonish illustration of this kind of symbiotic relationship between motivations and emotions when it comes to motivated reasoning more generally, which often involves a kind of implicit emotion regulation in which the brain, or I prefer to say the mind or the person, converges on judgments that minimize negative and maximize positive affective states associated with threat to or attainment of motives, where the specific kinds of emotions being regulated are going to be specific to the kinds of motives and goals that are underpinning a specific example of motivated reasoning. So I'll return to that in a bit more depth when I turn to the predictions of the strategic delusions hypothesis later on. Thirdly, motivated reasoning is not sort of the direct choice of a belief, as I mentioned earlier, but rather operates via sort of unconsciously adjusting various aspects of information processing in a way that's going to make it more likely that we'll end up with the belief that we want to end up with. So for example, when we want to believe something, we'll often sort of seek out evidence which confirms what we want to believe and neglect evidence in tension with it, a kind of motivated confirmation bias. We'll apply highly asymmetric standards to evidence which does bear on the belief. We'll sort of opportunistically assign trust and distrust to testimony in accordance with whether it's telling us what we want to hear or not. And it's via these sort of indirect, biased ways of seeking out, neglecting, and processing information that individuals end up with the kinds of beliefs that they have a sort of vested interest in ending up with. And those are exactly the kinds of biases you should expect to see if I'm right in connecting strategic delusions to motivated cognition more broadly. And then finally, and relatedly, motivated reasoning is subject to a kind of rationalization constraint. By which I mean, when we engage in motivated reasoning, even though we're sort of forming a belief for reasons independent of its truth, we can generally only bring ourselves to believe something if we can identify some kind of genuinely epistemic justification for that belief. And that means that even when it comes to sort of really bizarre beliefs, if this story is correct, you should still expect individuals to feel compelled to develop some kind of genuinely sort of epistemic justification for them. So if you take a sort of belief or belief set like QAnon, it's not as if individuals just sort of stop short at the adoption of that belief. They develop a whole sort of elaborate network of rationalizations of the belief. They point to sort of hidden meanings and code words in Trump speeches, testimony from anonymous users on message boards, previous evidence of corruption from mainstream media, and so on. To outsiders, these justifications just look incredibly implausible, nowhere near sufficient to warrant justification of this conspiracy theory, but it's kind of noteworthy people bother developing these justifications at all, and I think connecting these kinds of phenomena to motivated reasoning potentially explains why. Okay, so just to briefly summarize what I've sort of advanced in this part of the talk, I started out by observing that certain kinds of widely held beliefs in the general population seem absurd, by which I meant sort of extremely irrational. And I argue that presents a kind of explanatory puzzle. Like, why is it that otherwise seemingly rational people sometimes capitulate to what seems like really striking bouts of irrationality? What I've tried to do in this talk is sort of take that framework for understanding certain kinds of puzzling behaviors that I outlined in part one of the talk and argue that you can, at least in principle, extend it to sort of psychological phenomena such as beliefs, where the idea is the absurdity of certain kinds of group-based beliefs is best viewed as a strategy for signaling in-group solidarity that's effective precisely because these beliefs are viewed as absurd by outsiders. And I've argued that shouldn't be understood as a kind of sui generis phenomenon, but rather understood in terms of more general phenomena of socially adaptive belief and sort of independently well-established mechanisms of motivated reasoning. So far, obviously, that's just a really kind of sketchy, schematic, how possibly model. So I haven't provided, obviously, any reasons to take this seriously so far. I've just tried to sort of present the case that it's at the very least coherent. Like maybe this is one thing that could be going on when it comes to certain kinds of strange or otherwise puzzling societal beliefs that seem deeply or profoundly irrational. Admittedly, though, that is like a fairly low bar. So I want to conclude by turning to the more interesting question of whether this is actually plausible when it comes to any particular class of beliefs and believers. So somewhat disappointingly, I have no idea whether this hypothesis is correct or not. But what I want to do is sort of conclude by sketching what I think are some predictions of this hypothesis, and then say a little bit about how I think sort of current evidence bears on these predictions. Although one of the recurring themes is going to be that I think in many of these cases, we just don't have good systematic data, precisely because this hypothesis hasn't really been considered in the psychological or sociological literature. So the real aim of this project is to sort of get people to take this seriously as at least a candidate explanation of what's going on in particular cases when it comes to strange beliefs. Before I run through these predictions, it's worth just sort of flagging two qualifications. Firstly, I definitely do not think this is going to apply in all cases in which groups are sort of organized around beliefs that seem irrational to outsiders. So I think in some cases, for example, beliefs that seem irrational to outsiders are really a kind of reasonable response to an unfortunate social epistemic environment. To take a kind of extreme example of this, if you're a child and you're raised within a cult, you're going to end up believing probably quite strange things about the world through no fault of your own, even if you're a kind of ideal epistemic agent. That's obviously a kind of extreme, rare case, but I actually think that point generalizes to many situations in which we're prone to attribute irrationality to groups. But I also think there are many cases in which groups organize around sort of genuinely irrational beliefs, where this irrationality is going to be explained by sort of other kinds of biases, motivations, and signaling strategies. Having said that, I do think this hypothesis is sort of especially well suited to explaining those cases in which groups are organized around beliefs that seem sort of extremely irrational, so much so they kind of strain the norms of intentional interpretation. Obviously, that's an empirical question that has to be adjudicated on a case-by-case basis. Secondly, even if this hypothesis does correctly describe what's going on in a particular case, it's still by its nature radically incomplete as an explanation. Specifically, it abstracts away from, and so itself offers no explanation of, the contents of absurd beliefs in specific cases. So it identifies a kind of doxastic strategy, to use a really annoying philosophical phrase, that might be applicable across a wide variety of otherwise very different cultural, subcultural, political, religious contexts. So in other words, it might explain why a group would sometimes gravitate towards sort of genuinely absurd beliefs, but it's never going to explain by itself why a group would gravitate towards specific beliefs in specific circumstances. Sort of more concretely, it might explain why a group would embrace a belief as seemingly ridiculous as QAnon, but it can't explain why they would embrace QAnon specifically. And in general, I think that latter question isn't going to have any sort of unifying answer. I think it's going to be dependent on all sorts of context-specific, contingent, social, psychological, institutional, historical factors. Happy to talk about those in discussion, but it is important to bear in mind they do sort of go beyond the scope of the hypothesis itself. Okay, having said that, I think this hypothesis does generate certain concrete predictions of things we should expect to observe if it's correct. I'm just going to run through these predictions and say a little bit about how I think sort of current evidence bears on them. So firstly, and most obviously, you would in fact expect to see these beliefs associated with the relevant pattern of in-group solidarity and out-group stigma. So individuals within the group should in fact treat these beliefs as signals of in-group solidarity and respond accordingly. And individuals outside of the group should in fact view these beliefs as absurd, and so as a cause for sort of ridicule or hostility. Now, obviously, the mere fact you find that pattern of evidence is not particularly good diagnostic evidence for this hypothesis, because it might be completely incidental, sort of irrelevant to what's actually going on when it comes to forming and maintaining these beliefs. On the other hand, if you sort of fail to observe that pattern of evidence, that would be decisive evidence against this hypothesis, because this pattern of responses is supposed to constitute a sort of essential part of the causal mechanism by which belief formation works on this hypothesis. Now, I'm not aware of any sort of systematic data that bears on this, but I do find it just very, very plausible that in many of these cases, you do in fact find this kind of pattern of in-group and out-group response. Secondly, you would expect to see a phenomenon I would call signaling without persuasion. And what I mean by that is, if this hypothesis is correct and the function of these beliefs is to signal in-group solidarity, there's no point being a kind of closet believer. Like, the whole function of the belief is to advertise a certain characteristic you have. So you would expect these beliefs to be associated with sort of eager efforts to display, advertise, signal the believer's commitment to the belief. Now, obviously, the mere fact that individuals communicate what they believe isn't good diagnostic evidence for this hypothesis. If I genuinely believe that Trump is involved in a covert crusade against Satan worshipping cannibalistic pedophiles, I'm sort of unlikely to remain silent about that fact. But on the other hand, there is a certain kind of communicative behavior here, which I think is much more difficult to understand than alternative explanations, which is what I would call signaling without persuasion. That is, insofar as you find individuals going to sort of great lengths to communicate their commitment to what they believe, and yet they don't have any corresponding motivation to actually persuade anyone else that these beliefs are credible or true, I think that's much more difficult to understand on non-signaling explanations, but it's sort of much more nicely predicted by the kind of hypothesis I'm considering in this presentation. Thirdly, you would expect to see the relevant kinds of sort of extreme motivated biases that I outlined earlier. And that's not trivial because, as I've already mentioned, certain kinds of group-specific beliefs that seem irrational might in fact be a reasonable response to an unfortunate social epistemic environment. This is actually a really difficult thing to adjudicate empirically because it's a kind of universal law of psychology that no matter how sort of bizarre some example of belief formation is, somebody will write a paper arguing that if you sort of squint in a particular way, you can interpret it as ideal Bayesian reasoning. But in my view, it's just like very, very plausible that in many of these cases, you do find like a really extremely biased treatment of information that constitutes a deviation, not just from sort of optimal, but from ordinary forms of inferencing reasoning. When it comes to QAnon, for example, like every single prediction of this conspiracy theory has been decisively disconfirmed, and yet its proponents don't seem to be any less confident in its main tenets. Fourth, you would expect these beliefs to sort of come into existence and go out of existence, not as a function of sort of contrary evidence, but rather as a function of the kinds of non-epistemic factors I outlined in the first prediction. That is sort of variation in how in-group members and out-group members respond to the relevant beliefs. So this hypothesis generates a kind of concrete experimental prediction, which is that you should be able to sort of manipulate people's attitudes towards such beliefs solely by manipulating their expectations about how other individuals are likely to respond to these beliefs in ways that has nothing to do with the truth of the relevant beliefs. Again, I'm not aware of any systematic empirical research on this prediction, but I do think it's sort of interesting empirical research to pursue in the future. Fifth, you would expect these beliefs to be associated with content-independent social emotions. And what I mean by that is the mere fact that an individual is sort of emotionally invested in or responds to a particular belief is not good diagnostic evidence for this hypothesis. So for example, if I believe that NASA is trying to cover up the fact that the Earth is flat, I'm sort of unlikely to be dispassionate about this. But in this case, my emotional reaction is to the content of the belief, the state of affairs that the belief represents. Whereas if the strategic delusions hypothesis is correct, you should expect to see these beliefs associated with the sort of pattern of social emotions that typically accompany sort of displays of in-group solidarity. So you should expect to see them associated with things like group-based pride. And you should expect individuals to treat evidence in tension with these beliefs, not as sort of just useful information with which they might update their model of the world, but as a kind of threat to their identity. And again, I don't think this has really been explored, but I just find it very, very plausible that you do in fact find these kinds of content-independent social emotions when it comes to many kinds of bizarre societal beliefs. I think that's sort of nicely predicted by this hypothesis. Six, you would expect these beliefs to be compartmentalized in the believer's mental life. So I mentioned earlier on that when it comes to sort of socially adaptive beliefs generally, you should expect individuals to be sort of reluctant to draw inferences from these beliefs or to act on these beliefs when these beliefs are not themselves socially rewarded, because otherwise you're going to sort of risk letting information that might be potentially inaccurate sort of compromise your ability to navigate reality. And I mentioned then that I think that when you turn to many sort of plausible candidates for socially adaptive belief, you do in fact find beliefs with this sort of strange functional profile. I think a really good illustration of this is Pizzagate, and here I've been really influenced by the work of cognitive scientist Hugo Mercier, who has a book out this year in which he presents an explanation of these sort of really bizarre conspiracy theories, which is very much so in line with what I'm arguing in this presentation. So many of you would have heard of Pizzagate because it was a kind of ancestor of QAnon, in which, if survey data is to be believed, millions of people professed to believe that Hillary Clinton was running an elaborate child trafficking operation from the basement of some random Washington pizzeria. And you probably heard of Pizzagate because one individual stormed into this pizza restaurant fully armed and demanded of the owners that they release the children that Hillary Clinton was keeping captive in the basement. Now, surprisingly, Hillary Clinton wasn't in fact keeping children captive in the basement of that random Washington pizzeria. So there's some sense in which what this guy did was like ridiculous as an action. But on the other hand, if you genuinely believed Pizzagate, what he did was actually quite reasonable. If you have very, very unreasonable beliefs, certain kinds of behaviors are going to follow rationally from those beliefs. So what's really puzzling is the millions of people who sort of profess to believe this conspiracy and seem to be sincere in their avowal of their commitment to this conspiracy. And yet the only thing they really did in terms of acting on this belief was just sort of bang on about how much they believe it and maybe go to a few Trump rallies and wave around placards. So as Hugo Mercier puts it, of the millions of people who believe the rumor, he, that is the person who stormed into this pizza parlor, was the only one to act as if he did so intuitively. I think that's nicely explained if you think the function of these beliefs is sort of fundamentally performative. Much more difficult to understand, I think, if you think the function of these beliefs is really a kind of like sincere effort to track how things are. And then finally, and this is the prediction that I'm sort of least sure of, but I'll mention it because I think it's interesting. This hypothesis I'm considering identifies a kind of fairly desperate strategy in which individuals try to sort of gain access to an in-group or a subculture, really by kind of alienating themselves from outsiders. So that means that if you're a member of lots of cross-cutting groups and you've got a sort of high sense of social standing within them, you're not really going to be prone to implement a strategy of this kind. Its cost would sort of dramatically outweigh its benefits. Whereas if you're an individual who's sort of ostracized, excluded, you've got weak social ties, weak social networks, you should be sort of correspondingly more likely to engage in a strategy of this kind in order to sort of gain access to a trusted in-group or subculture. Now, there is some sort of observational data which does bear in a suggestive way on this prediction. So, for example, ostracism is associated with a greater willingness to join extremist groups. A tendency towards extreme conspiracy theories is positively correlated with perceived low social standing and weak social networks. Now, obviously, there could be all kinds of explanations of this kind of data. And in general, it can't really tell between two different causal arrows, one in which sort of an embrace of fairly bizarre beliefs leads to a sense of ostracism and exclusion, and the other, which is, I'm arguing, potentially predicted by this hypothesis, in which ostracism makes one correspondingly more likely to sort of embrace group-specific absurdities. The only sort of experimental data I'm aware of which might be able to adjudicate between those in a particular case is a paper that came out this year by a group of political psychologists in which they demonstrated that inducing a sense of ostracism in experimental subjects increases their willingness to endorse unambiguously false partisan claims. Okay, so those are the predictions. As I mentioned, none of them are kind of particularly diagnostic individually, but I do think that collectively they would present like a fairly compelling case that this should at the very least be taken seriously in a particular case. And in my view, although I think there's loads more empirical research that needs to be done here, I find it like plausible in many of these cases that you do in fact find this sort of pattern of evidence. Okay, so just to sort of briefly, very briefly wrap things up, what I've tried to do in this talk is sort of clarify and explore the hypothesis that, at least in some cases, sort of seemingly absurd beliefs in society should be understood as signals of in-group solidarity, that are sort of credible signals precisely because they're viewed as absurd by outsiders and thus alienate in-group members from out-group members. And I've argued that shouldn't be understood as a sort of sui generis phenomenon, but rather should be understood in terms of more general phenomena of socially adaptive belief and socially motivated reasoning. Now, clearly, loads more theoretical, conceptual, philosophical, empirical work remains in order to sort of fill out the psychological and social details here, and also just to adjudicate to what extent this is really plausible when it comes to any particular class of beliefs and believers. But I hope at like the very least I persuaded you this hypothesis is not itself absurd and that this work is worth pursuing. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Dan. That was fantastic.